Audacious rebel.
We are a society that is unprecedentedly secular. Well, when you're talking about metaphysics at this level, which is literally beyond physics, you're always going to be speaking to some extent metaphorically. About the Catholic Church for a minute. It's had these huge, pedophilia scandals, right? And it's masked all these things up. But why was this covered up? Because the church felt the need to preserve itself and its image more than the teachings that it was created to promote.
Audacious rebel. Audacious rebel.
Today I have the honor of sitting with a man whose name echoes through the corridors of esoteric thought and spiritual scholarship, Richard Smoley. He's not just an author, he's a mystic, a philosopher, a man who's made it his life's work to decode the invisible architecture between religion, consciousness, and human existence. From 7 games of life to inner Christianity, from the dice game of Shiva to how God became God, Richard doesn't just write books, he opens portals. Trained at Harvard and Oxford, he could have followed the conventional path, but instead he chose the sacred one. Diving into the Kabbalah, exploring Tibetan Buddhism, and shaping the minds of thousands through his work as editor of the iconic Gnostic magazine. So I'm going to ask you now, don't just listen. Grab a pen, grab a notepad. You're going to need it. Because this conversation isn't just about information, it's about insight. And insight, when it lands, shifts everything. Ladies and gentlemen, seekers and rebels, help me welcome the brilliant, the extraordinary, to the path of the audacious rebel, Richard Smoley. Richard, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for that extremely kind introduction. I hope I'll be able to live up to it in the next hour, but I certainly look forward to trying.
Well, I had to cut it down a lot because if I had to share everything, that would have taken up the entire hour. Richard, the theme of this season podcast is the divine human, remembering what we are. Would you say that humanity has in fact forgotten its true nature? And in your view, what has caused this forgetting, this spiritual amnesia?
Well, many spiritual traditions teach the idea that we are all part of one enormous single cosmic human. And this human has many names in many different traditions. In the Kabbalah, it's called Adam Kadmon. In Hinduism, it's called Purush, a word that actually has a number of meanings in Hindu thought. And you could go on and on and on. Swedenborg, the 18th century mystic Emanuel Swedenborg called it the Maximus Homo, the greatest human. And the tradition says that this, by the way, this being was androgynous, right?
Right.
So it's both. It's not. It's both male and female, right? Well, the tradition says that this being, at some point, and this point cannot be placed on a historical timeline, because in a sense gave rise to history. Even the history of the universe as we know it, this being forgot its true nature and fell. That is to say, was shattered into billions of little pieces, each of which is walking around as you and me, imagining that we are separate and forgetting that we are all cells of this universal human. And the work, with a capital W, is to bring back this remembering of who we are not only individually, but collectively, and gradually bring this cosmic human back together. Again, this is a work that takes place in time, but it's not limited to time. And as I said, time as we know it is, in a sense, the consequence of this fall. So this fall was prior to time, even if you want to consider time as starting with a big bang, and it will sort of be after time, the end of time, so to speak, if that even can be conceived. So that is a very, very widespread teaching. I mean, another very recent version of it is in that contemporary spiritual text called A Course in Miracles, which calls this cosmic human the sonship, capital S-O-N, ship. And it says that we are not only all sons of God, but we are all the Son of God. God has only one Son, and we are part of it. Our minds are part of it. And our misery, the human tragedy of the human situation, sorrows come for having completely forgotten this fact. So that is basically a summary of what I might say to your question.
You've mentioned being in your response of the different traditions and the understanding of this higher force. Now, when I contemplate the being, I'm getting personification.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you're talking about metaphysics at this level, which is literally beyond physics, you're always going to be speaking to some extent metaphorically, because ordinary language and even ordinary concepts really don't quite do justice to these higher levels. All the same, we have to conceive of them somehow. And because we are persons, we're almost bound to conceive of them in personalistic terms. And if, shall we say, the infinite has infinite capacity, it also has capacity to relate to us and allow us to express ourselves as persons. So my essential answer to your question is that to a great extent, this is metaphorical, but it's a metaphor that it'd be very hard for our minds to get around.
Understood. Now, the initial question had to do with the fact that humanity seems to have forgotten what they are. You outline historical data, different cultures in terms of the essence of what may have been responsible for all of creation. But why do you think humanity today are not aware of this information in terms of their source, their connection as to the essence of what they are?
Most people aren't aware of the possibility, and they're largely not aware of the possibility because there's no great interest in it. I mean, as someone who's exploring these, rather deep issues, you must have already noticed that the number of people who are interested in these things, even among your friends, families, and acquaintances, is comparatively small. And I have friends who are much, as smart as I am, certainly richer and more successful, who have no interest in these things and no understanding or even attempt to understand these things. I might as well be talking to my dog. So I would say the great majority of people are aware of these possibilities because, in a sense, they're distracted. They think the things they're distracted by, the usual games of life, are the real issue when they're only, shall we say, distractions from the real issue.
You mentioned that people are just not interested in information like this. Do you think it has to do with their state of consciousness or how we have been conditioned as a society?
Well, I think the two are very closely interrelated. I mean, we are a society that is unprecedentedly secular. and anything larger than material reality is assumed or pretended, even insisted, not to exist. I mean, if you look at, say, many primitive cultures, there's an enormous array of myth, lore, legend, stories that, in their own way, attempt to point consciousness toward non physical levels. But everything in our society is meant to orient us away from that. And we're told that, if something isn't material in some form or another, it doesn't exist or may as well not exist. So the conditioning and the level of consciousness are very closely interconnected.
You think that is intentional?
Well, it would be hard to say by whom if it was intentional. I don't personally believe in the Gnostic concept of the archons as these kind of inferior deities who are standing between us and the truth, except in, again, a very metaphorical sense. These archons are, in a sense, the structures of our own consciousness, and they would include things like our conceptions of time, space, dimensionality, which are our little box for understanding the world. But if we seem to have forgotten that there's something outside this little box of sensory concepts and experience. And why did this happen? Well, I mean, if you want to look at it historically, the West was in the throes of the Catholic Church for millennia. And finally, this intellectual, spiritual stranglehold was so intense that with the Reformation and the Enlightenment, at least parts of the educated world just threw it off. And with that, they threw off any belief in the spiritual because there was almost a fear that if anything spiritual would kind of lead them back to Catholicism, which itself is an extremely defective conceptual structure. So it's been either that, believe in God in a very simplistic Christian, conventional Christian sense, or believe in nothing. And our society has, over the last 2 centuries, increasingly chosen to believe in nothing, which has its own negative consequences.
Exactly, and that was the next question I'm going to ask, because what we believe shapes our values, our attitudes, and of course our behavior. In my last series, actually, I was dealing with crime, and of course, crime is based on behavior. And if we are dealing with beliefs, then our beliefs in itself will direct the way that we think, the way that we act, the way that we are as parents, the way that we are as employees and employers. So I see the significance of this awareness. You often speak of the ego as a false self, an illusion shaped by memory, fear, and culture. If that is the false self, what do you think is the real I?
Yeah, and that's an important distinction to make because the word ego has any number of meanings. And I'm not really talking about it in the conventional sense because when in day-to-day language we use the term ego, we're basically talking about self-esteem. My ego was bruised. He has a big ego. He thinks a little more highly of himself than he really ought to. But ego, in the sense that I'm using it, is much broader and applies to the whole way that we structure our understanding of the world. I think it could, sometimes I call it the world generator. You're taking in all this experience from all the senses, and maybe more than all of the senses, and you're organizing them into this structure. And this is just a very narrow, limited, defective structure. One corroboration uh, actually comes out of cognitive science. You see, Irvine, there's a cognitive scientist named Donald Hoffman who's written a book called The Case Against Reality. And he's saying our cognition is structured for survival. That is to say, we're there to recognize food, predator, prey, so on. And our cognitive structure, even our senses, are highly limited and specialized in this sense because they're not open to anything else, at least not normally. We believe they don't exist. Now, I have mentioned that other societies, past and present, are aware of these things. They have not deadened their senses in this regard to the extent that we have. But that's our situation, and shall we say, the contemporary Western ego does seem very deadened to anything apart from the material.
You know, many traditions speak of a fall. You have the Adam and Eve story, Sophia in the Gnostic text, or the Kabbalistic shattering of the vessels. How do you understand this idea of a fall? Is it something literal? Is it something symbolic? Or something else in its entirety? How do you classify this?
Well, I would classify it as a cognitive fall, kind of a cosmic blackout. And, as A Course in Miracles says, the Son of God fell into this kind of illusion that there only being one Son of God, you know, kind of forgot not to laugh at. And I'll use A Course in Miracles because I think it's a very powerful teaching. Let's say this sonship, and this is again beyond timelines of history or cosmogony as contemporary science knows it. It's prior to all of that. There, shall we say, the Son of God, which is all of us, imagined that he could be separate from God, and this idea terrified him so much that he thought God was angry at him, and he fell and fashioned himself this cognitive world, which is the world we live in now, which is a world of basically good and evil. I mean, it's almost impossible to conceive of a world as we know it without good and evil, whether you want to think of human evil or just kind of bad things that happen to people. So I would say, it is a cognitive fall more than what conventional Christianity likes to tell us, which is a moral fall, because that kind of perpetuates the sense of guilt and isolation. That is, in a sense, the whole problem to begin with. So I would say it's essentially a cognitive fall.
Understood. You know, in your book, Inner Christianity, you say the true teachings of Christ point us inward to the divine within. What does this inner path look like in practice, and why do you think it was pushed to the periphery of mainstream religion?
Well, since your question has two parts, and I'll answer the first part first. There is something in us that, shall we say, we can call I, capital I. And this is not the physical body. It's not the personality. It's not the psyche. It is that which, shall we say, sees and cognizes all of this world, as Christianity calls it. The Gospels talk a great deal about the world. This is, I suggest, what it means. And we identify ourselves with this world, either the sensory world, our desires, our psychological world, our egos, thoughts, feelings, and so on. But there's a little bit of trick required to step back and realize that what is witnessing all of this is quite apart from what it is witnessing. Francis of Assisi said, "What you are looking for is what is looking." Well, this, in a way, is your answer, and in a way, it's your problem, because if it's always what's looking, if it's always what's seeing, you're never going to see it. And as a result, because you forget about this, you believe it doesn't exist, and you look for it in all sorts of external things, which is exactly where it's not. And you'll see this very often in, films and books and something, where people, who am I? What am I? They don't know. And a lot of times, their answer is found in some sort of social identity, whether it is as a LGBTQ, whether it is a Republican, a Democrat, a MAGA, a progressive, a Catholic, a fundamentalist. These people glom onto these identities as kind of life rafts, because they've simply forgotten who they are, which is this I that is witnessing. Now, this I that is witnessing is not strictly speaking God, but it can be called the Son of God, in the sense that this is where we link up with God as such, with the absolute Brahman, whatever you want to call it. And this isn't all that difficult if you spell it out fairly clearly, but it rarely is. Now, I'll answer the second part of your question. How is this lost? Well, here is what happens. There is a very powerful and profound spiritual impulse that goes out into the world, as it did with Christianity in its early centuries. And this was world changing. It transformed and, to a certain extent, destroyed the Roman Empire. And a lot of people were attracted to it. And it grew in numbers and in wealth and in power. Well, when that happens, an institution like that is bound to attract people who are interested in money, wealth, and power. And they take over. The people who have a genuine spiritual impulse, in a sense, let it happen, because wealth, power, and all that are things, precisely things they're not interested in. So, eventually the church and the churches became a power structure that is really chiefly interested in self-perpetuation. And this mystic inner truth, this inner knowledge, can never really be completely lost, but is pretty deeply buried. I mean, to talk about the Catholic Church for a minute, it's had these huge, pedophilia scandals, right? And it's masked all these things up. Apparently, the Anglican Church in Britain has two, but I know less about. Well, I don't know much about any of them. But why was this covered up? Because the church felt the need to preserve itself and its image more than the teachings that it was created to promote. Obviously, this kind of abuse is totally against the spirit of Christ, totally against the spirit of the Gospels. But this was permitted because the institution had first priority, even at the cost of moral baseness and truth. And I think if you think about this, this explains a great deal about the history of the West in the last 2,000 years.
In the dice game of Shiva, you explore how consciousness shapes our reality. Can you break this down for our listeners? How is consciousness not just passive awareness, but the very substance of creation itself?
Yeah, I mean, it's very paradoxical and ostensibly difficult to understand. but in a way it builds on what I was saying. This consciousness does nothing but cognize. To say it's passive is maybe a bit far, but it only does that. And it cognizes something. There is what perceives and what is perceived. And just by that act just by that act of perception, it brings everything into existence. Now, this is most clearly stated in the Hindu school of the Sankhya, which talks about two things. One is called Purush, which basically means that's pure consciousness, which we can identify with the I that I've already described, and what it calls Prakriti, which is everything, the world. Now, you notice one thing, particularly if you meditate, that this Purush, this I, is very still and silent. In fact, understanding this is half the point of meditation. But you'll also notice that what is perceived, and this is both the inner world, the world of your psyche, and the world that is apparently external out there, is ceaselessly moving, ceaselessly changing. You can't stop it. You can't even stop your thoughts for a second. So Purush is active in the sense that it cognizes, but all of the work is done by the world, which is called Prakriti. And that's why they are metaphorically referred to as male and female, because in human gestation, the male doesn't really do too much. The sperm just kind of goes in and, the guy is around or he's not or whatever. The woman does all the work in constructing the embryo and developing it and so on. This is analogous to the cognition of Purush, which does nothing but cognize, and Prakriti, which does all the work, the constant, ceaseless churning of what we know as existence.
You you describe love as something deeper than feeling, a kind of sacred recognition. How do we as a society move from the conditional, transactional forms of love that we're used to into something more divine?
Well, of course, there are many definitions of love, most of them rather vague, and sentimentality intrudes very often in an unhelpful way. Let me give you my definition of love, which is love unites self and other while respecting the integrity of each. That is, you are joined to someone else, but you don't subsume them. They don't subsume you. Sometimes people say, I love you so much I could just eat you up. I mean, that's of course metaphorical, but we could say that the lion loves the lamb. The lion loves the lamb so much that it wants to make the lamb part of itself. And while this is undoubtedly the case, we don't really call that love, because it's not respecting the integrity of the lamb. That's why I added that rider, while respecting the integrity of each. And of course, this is easy or hard to do. There are, of course, many dimensions of love, and we use the same word to characterize all kinds of versions of it, ranging from pure spiritual love to ordinary lustful urges. I don't think any of these are either particularly good or bad in themselves. Obviously, it's not wise to mistake one for the other, which people often do. Like when people fall in love, they sometimes say, I love so and so unconditionally. I don't really care what happens to us. I just want the best for her or him. 6 weeks later, they break up, and the two wish each other nothing but evil. So obviously, this unconditional love that was supposed at the beginning was nothing of the kind. And so love, even when it's sincere, is often derailed by ego, by physical needs, by all sorts of deterrents. Again, I'm not railing against the state of affairs because it is the human state of affairs. But I think it's fairly wise to have a clear distinction of what kind of love you're talking about and thinking about. Um, uh, Here's another example of possibly false unconditional love, which is parenting. Well, in a sense, the parent loves the child, would sacrifice the life for the child, and so on and so on. But there are certain conditions. One, it is the fact that it is your child, right? You don't feel that way about someone else's child. It's yours. And people, to a certain extent, very often regard their children as kind of property. They have expectations for them. If the child does or doesn't become a doctor or a lawyer, they've disappointed the parents, quite apart from whether they want to be or even good at being a doctor or a lawyer. It's like, well, I raised this child all this time. I gave all of this. And the least they could do is take on some certain position in the world that's I find acceptable. There's a Canadian author named Ernest Seton Thompson, who, when he was 21, was presented with a bill by his father. And this itemized bill was for all of the expenses that the father had incurred in raising Ernest Thompson Seton, starting with the midwife's fee. And the father just presented him with this bill, and Ernest Thompson Seton, I think it is. Seton just paid it and never spoke to his father again. I mean, that's an extreme case, but I'm a parent myself. I have two sons. There's always a little bit of that going on. And the point, again, as I keep saying over and over again, is simply to be honest with ourselves about it and see to what extent this is the case, what we're doing, and not trying to pretend it's something else.
If the divine is already within us, as you have outlined in so many of your work, what is the purpose of the human journey? Why incarnate? Why forget? What is the purpose of this all?
Well, I will reply to that by retelling the myth of Genesis. Well, there was this man and woman, and life for them was pretty good. They had everything they wanted. They didn't even have words like suffering or pain in their vocabularies. And one day these people came to God and said, "Hey, God, hey, Lord, we've heard about this thing called good and evil. And it sounds kind of cool. We'd like to try it." And God said, "This is not a good idea. I do not suggest you do that." And I said, "Oh, come on, we want to." And God said, "Well, all right, but you're going to have to descend to a realm where you have to work hard for a living and it hurts to have babies." And as you can just see, I've just described the myth of Genesis. So the fall of Genesis was the fall into this physical realm. And one can only speculate about the motives. A Course in Miracles would say, well, the Son of God momentarily forgot and fell into fear. Although I suppose you could take a more benign interpretation of it as, well, people just wanted to see what it's like down here, and see what this kind of experience is like. And I mean, I can tell you this infallibly about you and every person who will ever listen to this and every person who will ever not listen to this. this is infallibly the case, and you cannot refute me. You have known some good and some evil in your life. I know the proportions seem to vary wildly and unfairly, but everyone knows good and evil to some degree and to some extent. So the human race, so to speak, got what it was asking for.
Um, do you, Richard, do you see the human being as a layered reality, physical, energetic, and spiritual? And how do you understand the body not as an obstacle, but as a vehicle of remembering the divine?
Mhm. Well, I think the first step is, in a sense, to get to know your body. And, your body kind of exists in two ways. One, as a physical object out there in the world. But it only exists partly that way for you because uh, the physical body, is a vehicle of experience. And the more you can experience the totality of the body, the more, well, at least the more whole your life will be. For example, there's a whole world of internal sensation. And, the easiest way to discover this is to simply meditate and pay attention to the sensations of the body as they arise. And what you may and probably will notice, at least eventually, is that sensation becomes something different than we superficially conceive of it as. Since suddenly you can start to feel sensation and sensations as kind of internal movements of energy of some kind. And if you pay enough attention to this, you start to feel, well, they're kind of currents. Sometimes it may feel like winds, as a term that's used for them. And this is the subtle body at one level. You can call it the etheric body. There are many, many names for it, but this is the body of your own experience. And again, you're witnessing this experience. You're witnessing these sensations with the eye, with the Parush. And as I've already suggested, they transform into something else, which is considerably more fluid and arguably more potent and arguably more therapeutic, because I think you could argue that the more these energies are flowing in a natural way, the healthier you are. You could, it's my impression, acupuncture, for example, is meant to stimulate flows in this energy that we're not aware of, but that, someone properly trained can diagnose it and treat. So that is, in a sense, the subtle body. Then there's what you might call the astral body. And this is, although it sounds very mystical, you could see it, the astral body, as the totality of thoughts and emotions, memories, imaginations that are contained in your psyche. All of it. The stuff you can see and are aware of, the stuff you can't see and aren't aware of, as psychologists like Freud showed to us. And this is its own world that you're carrying around with you. It, in a sense, overlaps with the body of feeling because emotions are very directly linked with physical feelings. William James said that the emotions are the mind's perception of bodily responses. And I don't think you need to take that wholesale to see if there's some insight of it. So the other thing, the next is your this body of thoughts thing, and it's around you, it surrounds you. It may even surround you in a kind of physical sense, in that it gives you what people sometimes call an aura. Now, auras, as perceived by clairvoyants, and there are clairvoyants who can and do see these things in a visual way, often as patterns of color. That is not the case with most of us. I mean, I have seen something like that a few times now and then, but we perceive other people's astral bodies, shall we say, sensorily. That guy gives me the creeps. That I just feel like that person is just so warm and loving and nice to be. That is, you're in a sense, you're perceiving their astral body. You know somebody is no good the minute you set eyes on him. And of course, dogs are famously better at it than humans, because dogs do not have the mental conceptual structure that stands in the way. They perceive directly with their emotions. And, when someone no good steps into the house, they start barking furiously. So that those are two levels of body, in addition to, the body as anatomical object. And exploring and delving into and understanding and perceiving both of these dimensions in ourselves, I think, are an important part of the way.
Understood. Richard, I had 150 questions to ask, and I thought that we would have explored so much, but this internet is really frustrating me. So let me wrap up. If you could leave humanity with just one insight, though, one truth to carry through life, what would it be?
Well, I think the most important thing is a rather neglected word, which is ordinary human decency. You go through life with all of these morals, all of these dictums going on in your head, all of this moralizing, all of this, as you've already seen, love, real and so-called. This can all get very, very confusing, and does get very confusing. But I think everyone, who's at all sane, has a sense of ordinary human decency. That's kind of just the right thing to do in that circumstance. It's, I would say, it's much more intuitive than rule-based. And it's much more in the moment. Just, someone needs your help. An old woman is struggling to open the door, so you hold the door for her. That is nothing more than ordinary human decency. And it need not and should not be sentimentalized. And I think if basically people just were connected to this, on a day-to-day, hour-by-hour basis, and were aware of it, there will be irritations and impulses that will distract you and may prevent you. But I think if you go around to this bedrock of basic human decency, that is probably the single most important thing in human life.
But indeed, this conversation has been very profound. And before we close, can you identify how people, if they want to connect with you, how they could get your books and whatnot, if they want to research you further? Do you have a website, as the case may be?
Yeah, I have a website called innerchristianity.com or richardsmoley.com. They go to the same address. My books are available on all the usual sites, hopefully in bookstores as well as on the usual online agencies. I have a lot of videos. I do a number of YouTube videos for the Theosophical Society. I edit Quest, which is the journal of the Theosophical Society, which is an organization that is devoted to studying and exploring the very questions that we've been talking about. And I do a number of lectures and interviews for them. So, you actually could binge watch me on YouTube if you really wanted. So those would be some areas. There's a long Wikipedia article about me that kind of more informational. So,
Gotcha.
Well, anyway, I really appreciate the, it's been a pleasure and an honor to talk with you. Your questions have been extremely stimulating and interesting. So I'm very grateful. And I hope your listeners find something useful in what I've said.
But to my audience, I hope you were taking notes. I'm really grateful to have someone like Richard on this show today. What you have just heard wasn't just theory, it was a reminder, a call back to essence, because remembering what we are is not just about escaping the world, it's about transforming how we live with it. So whether you're raising children, navigating pain, or wrestling with your own shadow, this is the work. This is the part of the Audacious Rebel, not just resisting the system, but remembering the soul. Until next time, stay aware, stay audacious, and stay on that path. Have a blessed one.
Audacious Rebel.